Welcome to the Language Access Lectern, a PGLS podcast focused on language access in K-12 schools. I'm your host, Mark Byrne.
Hello and welcome to yet another edition of the Language Access Lectern, a PGLS podcast that celebrates champions for language access in K-12 schools. This edition of our podcast is going to be a little bit different. A couple months ago, I was invited on the Brand the Interpreter podcast by Mireya Perez. She's the Language Access Program Manager over at Arlington Public Schools, adjacent here to Washington, D.C. in Virginia. Tremendous opportunity for me to come on and talk about the work that we're doing to support our K-12 partnerships who are interested in providing interpreters or translators to support and promote language access in their schools. Certainly a very humbling moment for me in my career to be invited on my first podcast and talk about our expertise in the field of language access. Mireya is a tremendous podcast host. I certainly learned a lot, not only about, the world of language access, but of course, about, hosting podcasts and things like that. So incredibly grateful for her for having me on the podcast for the first time. And, certainly, looking forward to, hopefully having future conversations with her as well. But she was great enough to allow me to take the recording that we produced together and promote it on my podcast, the Language Access Lectern. So again, a big thanks to Mireya, not only, for having a conversation with me about language access in K-12 schools, but all the work she does to shine a light on interpreters and translators who are working not only in the K-12 space, but also, healthcare or the legal field or things like that. So it was a great privilege to come on the Brand the Interpreter podcast. And again, very grateful that Mireya was willing to allow me to produce it on our channel as well. So without further ado, stepping to the lectern for the very first time, Mark Byrne.
Mark, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for being here today.
Absolutely a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I think today's conversation is going to be both entertaining, educational, and it's just going to be jam-packed with hopefully a lot of information, practical information that our listeners can actually utilize in their day-to-day, right? At least that's what I'm thinking.
I'll deliver, I promise.
Let's begin by getting to know Mark a little bit more. Mark, if you would be so kind as to just sharing a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up and what maybe was a fond childhood memory of yours?
Yeah, sure. I was born in Evanston, Illinois, which is just a little bit north of Chicago. I grew up in Glenview, kind of tying back into the Evanston feel. One of my favorite childhood memories. I'm a big football fan, always have been. And one of my youngest memories is the 1995 Northwestern Rose Bowl team. And my dad would take us to all sorts of games, let me bring some friends. And, Northwestern had a history of just not being very good at football. We're talking terrible at football, embarrassingly bad, like incredible multi-season losing streaks. So in 1995, when the program, it became, prominent and able to, deliver results, we were at every game and rushing the field with my dad and having him put me up on the goalpost while I tore the goalpost down with the rest of the Wahoos. That was a lot of fun. So that's my, one of my earliest childhood memories, of myself and my dad and my family here in Evanston. Fun story.
I can see how that would be a great memory.
I took my son to his first, actually it wasn't his first football game. His first football game was a Northwestern game when he was about 6 weeks old. 8 weeks old, something like that.
Oh, wow.
We had the little headphones on him. Like I said, I'm fanatical, but I brought him to a Notre Dame football game a couple of weeks back when they lost to Northern Illinois. We were there with my son. I don't think my son's getting invited back to Notre Dame Stadium soon.
It's okay. Like there'll be other times when he'll have better memories, I'm sure, like you.
Yeah. Hopefully that's not his first football memory.
Tell me a little bit about the demographics of the town where you grew up. How was that for you?
Yeah, no, I did not grow up with a bilingual or multilingual background. The community that I grew up in has experienced, a rapidly growing EL student population. I went to Glenbrook 225 for high school. Great district, and some tremendous leaders over there at Glenbrook who are doing remarkable things in building out dual language programs for students there, and really rising to the occasion of promoting language access there at the Glenbrooks. So While it wasn't that way when I went to school there, the fabric of the community has certainly, kind of evolved and changed over the years, and certainly more of a multilingual community nowadays.
You ended up eventually, and we'll get into that piece a little bit later on, but you did end up fast forward present day in the world of language access. Why don't you share with us a little bit about how sort of like the blocks to getting you to that point started? So give us a little bit of background as to where it all began now that you think back at it.
Yeah. So, thinking about how I grew up, came from, relatively low income family, struggled a little bit growing up, really didn't have a lot of opportunities to travel or get exposed to culture. So when I did have the opportunity to, put myself through college, we had some travel opportunities as part of the mission at Holy Cross College to, do some cultural immersion programs. And I found myself in Peru. And of course, I took high school Spanish, I took college level Spanish. And then when I got involved with that immersion program, I mean, it's, a faith-based organization where we came in and we did service in the community. So, we worked for local food pantry and some of their programs to support some children with disabilities as well. So we were there for 3 weeks and just getting immersed in that culture and seeing different parts of the world and really getting to understand, just how broad the world is. From a language perspective, it was so interesting being there in Peru. I actually got to hear Quechua spoken. And I thought that was I thought it was just the coolest thing. And my Spanish was pretty good at the time. Of course, I can't understand any Quechua, but just hearing it spoken, in an authentic setting was just so incredibly neat to me. And it was one of those experiences that really stuck out with me. So, upon graduating from college, was thrilled to get out into the world. I worked for a little bit in printing services. I then transitioned over to work as a marketing consultant in the financial services industry. The company I was working for got sold. So I was, finding myself, looking for jobs, and a recruiter reached out to me and they said, Mark, we have this interesting opportunity. It's strange. It's out there. It's not what we've talked about before. It's a Chinese translation agency. They're interested in you for, coming on board and, doing a business development role with them. Would you be open to that? I said, well, I'd be open to a conversation. I'm always curious. Had a conversation with some of their leadership, and part of that that package that was appealing to me was the opportunity to travel to China and really kind of like dive in and double down on my curiosity for culture. And a few months into my tenure there, a company was called EC Innovations. A couple months into my tenure there, I was able to get out to China and spend 3 weeks out there, and it was for the company's 20th anniversary. So got to spend some time with some of my peers out there, some of the colleagues that I've been working with over the past couple months, some of their clients, and then also got to do some travel and cultural immersion across mainland China. So that was a really neat experience. It led me to the language industry. I'm very passionate about the world of K-12 education, and I think a part of that is because I had a lot of challenges coming up in education. I'm actually kind of almost proud to admit it, but I'm a high school dropout. Went back in, got some, went through the alternative program, got my high school diploma, ended up going to a community college. Didn't have a lot of options when I went to a 4-year university based on my grade point average, but it kind of allowed me to rise and allowed me to, be authentic and tell my story in these K-12 schools. And now as I come back, all these many years later, to be a prominent face in promoting language access in K-12 schools and leverage my curiosity of culture and my passion for helping improve student outcomes, through language services, it's a very compelling story that I can get out and tell. So it can be very humbling thinking about, where you're from and what your past looks like. I do think that being authentic and being comfortable in your own skin while being honest with people and being mission driven is really kind of a superpower for me. Just down to earth, and knowing that I'm, making a very small difference means a lot to me. I don't so much think about the output of my efforts, but I think more about the impact of my efforts. And I'm excited for, continuing on that path.
Yeah, and we'll get to talking as to where you are currently at a little up ahead, but I'd like to go back to your experience in Peru.
Yeah.
So aside from having heard the Quechua language and being immersed in that for 3 weeks, what did you bring home from that experience? What did you see as potentially just a contrast in the way you lived here in the States, for example, as opposed to the communities that you were serving? What did that look like for you being young out there in a foreign country? What was that like for you?
It was an eye-opening experience. It made me appreciate, a lot of the sacrifices that my family has made for me over the years. Like I said at the onset, I didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth by any means. But when you start to see, what global poverty looks like and what poverty looks like in other countries, man, does it really make you appreciate, what we got going on here in the United States of America. I came home feeling a great sense of gratitude. After that 3-week immersion program, my language skills were definitely sharper. I wish I could have stayed for another 5 months.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things, if you don't use it, you lose it. And, I don't get a chance to work with my Spanish nearly enough. So that is a sore subject. But yeah, I think just mostly I came back with a great sense of gratitude and appreciation and just like respect for, people and other cultures. And at the end of the day, we shared a lot of smiles, when we were over there. And, I spent a lot of time running around playing soccer with kids and basketball and things like that, hobbies of mine, passions of mine that I got to share with people. And it was awesome. It was awesome.
And then your experience out years later out in China. So it's business. Were you working through an interpreter when you were out there working with them, or had you learned the Chinese language?
Oh my goodness, no, not even close, not even close. Yeah, I can't even remember the drinking expressions that they would have, like gala or gambe or something like that. Bottoms up. That's about all I got in China. But yeah, no, the folks that I was assigned to, I don't think he was a professional interpreter. He was a project manager for the organization, and he spent a lot of time with me out there, and we established a great friendship. He was a lot of fun to pal around with, and we ended up working closely together for a couple of years after that. So it was a good way to kick off a relationship and friendship with him.
He was what we now call one of the ad hoc interpreters, huh? Someone that was bilingual in the firm and was your assigned interpreter, perhaps.
Yeah, he had his hands full that week, let me tell you, because I wanted to go everywhere and talk to everyone and shake hands with everybody and just make sure we connected. So he was working, that's for sure.
That's so great. I was just curious, like, oh, what happened there? Like, was there an interpreter involved, or was that your first experience with an interpreter? Now, I want to fast forward from these experiences, in the beginning of your journey into language access, into how you got started and what were those opportunities that led you into language access. Because I feel like there was some experiences with language, with foreign countries and going into different cultures and experiencing that. But it was, I'm assuming, through a series of events that led you into language access. You arrive in the language access world, but then you also stayed. So I want to go into what were the series of events that potentially occurred that led you into the language access world, and then what inspired you to stay in that and expand in this world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, curiosity of culture. It all comes down to that in terms of getting started. And, of course, I've had experiences working in the corporate world in a business development role. I've sold a lot of different things, whether it be, my own time consulting or marketing services, professional services. I've sold curriculum, data solutions in a K-12 setting. So I've done a lot of different things. Nothing really makes me feel as good as I do about positioning language services in a K-12 setting, though. Just because I know that, language companies across the United States and probably globally, they don't really focus on the K-12 schools as much as they should, right? Many of these organizations are very focused on healthcare, life sciences, other industries where, they'll devote more of their time and resources, and K-12 schools simply get left behind sometimes, in terms of, how you think about developing solutions specifically for those. So in terms of why I choose to stay in the language services in the role that I am in currently, it's a great opportunity for me to advocate for families, advocate for multilingual students, school staff, but also the interpreters that we work with, right? So just a great opportunity for me to kind of wrap my arms around the world of language access and be a champion for all people who are supporting these multilingual families and schools. Again, just kind of similar to my experience in Peru, I am absolutely filled with gratitude to be able to do the work that I do.
What is it about language access in schools that you feel, sort of inspires your work? Because I think that when individuals hear language access and they hear public education, potentially are thinking interpreters, check, and the provision of the service, basically. But I think we the listeners know that there's a lot more involved in language access, and so I'd like to know what you, Mark Byrne, see in the world of language access. What are you seeing as the gaps that you feel that you as the individual with your experiences and your knowledge brings in to be able to offer and provide more information? I think that really that's what it's about, right? When we talk about language access in schools, it's about not only expanding the service itself, but expanding the knowledge behind the work. And so what is it that inspires your work in language access?
So first and foremost, is somebody who's really kind of struggled in, their own education, their own experience, who's, sat through those disciplinary hearings, who sat through the special education meetings where, they're trying to get you some additional supports to help get you through, when they're trying to make outplacements for you once it's, clear that, you're not going to be able to make it through the school year, based on how it's going for you. I remember sitting in those meetings and having a really hard time processing, understanding, maybe my mind was elsewhere dealing with, trauma or challenges that I was facing in the moment. So I've sat in that seat, I know what that feels like. And, I'm also blessed and very fortunate and privileged. I don't have a language gap, right? I had a great school district that I was a part of. They've done unbelievable things for me. And, of course, coming out of that experience, going into higher education, I had to take remediated math courses. If you look at the data, very few students, less than 10% of students who have to take remediated math courses or any courses for that matter, remediated courses, go on to achieve their diploma. Not only have I gone on and got my 4-year diploma, I have a master's degree on top of that. So, I really do view myself as a 1%er in education. And, that's something that, I take serious as a lifelong learner. And I'm very grateful for the people who worked with me at the Glenbrooks to help get me through, to get me to this point. Important to note that I never quit on myself. So, of course, my own experience, carries with me, throughout the process. Of course, when you start thinking about, the experience, that multilingual families have in the special education realm, engagement is so important, right? I had my family there at all those meetings advocating on my behalf. They got me through, they got me to the next level. Well, when there is a language gap with a family, it can be very difficult for them to advocate on behalf of their students, their family. It's difficult for the school staff to be able to get understanding of what's going on at home and what those challenges are. And at the end of the day, we want to help as educators, right? It's a great opportunity to serve multilingual learners, of course. And the other thing that I think really shapes my foundation and my understanding of the K-12 space and how I view language access stems from my experience working with student data at a company called ECRA Group. So they're a research and analytics firm. I was there for a little over a year. But it gave me a real unique insight into how school leaders think about education, but then also the achievement gaps that exist across, different student groups across education. So when you look at multilingual families and you see that, very few of them are, achieving, the student growth rates that their peers are. Well, if we don't grow those multilingual learners at rates that are accelerated for that of their peers, then those achievement gaps are going to continue to exist for years and years and years to come. So understanding that and realizing the opportunity that exists there for schools to stimulate student growth for multilingual learners and the impact that language services can have on driving engagement, I think is a really important component for school leaders to think about and understand. And that's the business of schools, right? Academic return on investment is not about dollars that are invested for financial return like you would think about in the business setting, but it's about dollars invested for student growth. And as I think about the language services space and how we, position, these services, of course, we need to bring resources and training and, an understanding of why we're using these services to the end users who are using these support services. But we also need to share that story with school leadership, school boards, leaders in the community, stakeholders across our community, and share the impact that language services can make in a K-12 setting. Engagement is a critical component for driving student growth. And you could plug a Google search in or throw a dart at a map, and you'll find data to support that engagement drives growth in K-12 schools. So when I think about my experience, broadly, and there's been plenty of struggle for me. I'm really excited as I have matured in my career to be able to kind of leverage some of my challenges, some opportunities, where I've kind of fallen flat, like in education, my own education and participating in my own education. And to be able to, tell that story, which I'm, blessed to be able to do, with many institutions, will invite me out to talk a little bit about my experiences and some of my struggles and how I've gotten to be, that 1%er in education. So it's what keeps me motivated. Like I said, I've done a lot of different things in my life, but nothing inspires me like this.
What have you been able to see in your current role when it comes to going out there and having these conversations with leadership? And I want to sort of give like the big picture for individuals that aren't necessarily involved in public education, right? Let's say that their expertise is medical or elsewhere in the community. But in education, there's like these different layers of administration, and all of them potentially are involved in the conversation surrounding language access. Their language access in many school districts, for example, are broken components. And what I mean by that, it's you've got one piece being worked in one department, and then you've got another piece of language access being worked on in a different department. And then, of course, like in many situations, those departments don't speak to one another. And so it's like broken components, right? But when you have access to speaking directly to individuals at a different level, such as you mentioned currently, board members, school board members, superintendents that typically, I'm not saying all, but typically don't really have a conversation at the school level regarding language access. It could potentially be that there's unique school districts out there that have superintendents and board members that understand language access and all its complexities, but it's very rare. It's like the unicorn. Would you agree? So,
I would.
Yeah. So what are you noticing in having these conversations and having the ability to have access to these specific individuals? What is it that you're seeing?
Well, I do think a lot of curiosity, an interest in technology, always, a focus on compliance around, state and federal legislation. That's always a key term that, especially superintendents are going to understand, right? They want to make sure that they're being compliant with, what's required of them, by the Department of Education or, by their state legislation. So that's always going to be a consideration and a concern. But, you did touch on something at the onset of your question. And, I will say that as I'm out talking to people, language access is not equal in all 50 states. And, I don't want to make this a political comment, but I think there's a lot more that we can do in schools to be supportive of our multilingual families. And, as it relates to language access, being more considerate of tools and putting together a more comprehensive plan around language access is important. So many, if not all, of our schools have a strategic plan, and it relates to growth and buildings and, creating different services within the district. But language access is never a component of that strategic plan. So because what you mentioned to me was that different departments are disconnected from the work that they're doing to support language access across schools. And that's part of the conversation that I'm trying to bridge, or I'm trying to connect that with different departments and help them tell their story as to how they support multilingual families across the community. And it's a tremendous value that we provide in that sense, because there's a disconnect there. And, if the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, then we're going to have a hard time, putting our hands around a student and helping them, achieve as much success as they could possibly have. And, that's true whether they're a multilingual family, or if they're a family or a student who's deaf or hard of hearing. Being able to put together those supports for families and understand, what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, to drive growth, I hope, right? To help those students improve their student outcomes, very important. And, that's the type of conversations that I'm trying to have with school leadership. And, when I do get an opportunity to speak with directors of, multilingual departments, they speak that language, and they know that this is a direction that the industry is going to. The education industry is what I'm referring to. I do anticipate that the Department of Education is going to put out some guidelines around language access planning in the years to come. It would not surprise me in the least if it was mandatory for all schools to put together a language access plan for all their families, and as a component of a strategic plan. And I think about what the impact of that could be across 20,000 schools in this country, something like that. School districts. And, it's a remarkable opportunity as I think about, the seat that I'm sitting in, the work that I'm doing, and the ability to, really have an impact. I think language access planning is going to be a great way for me to be able to do that with school partners. So I think this should be, on the tip of school leaders' tongues, especially if they're focused on supporting multilingual communities.
Absolutely. Pre-recording, we spoke about a lot of things, but one of those things that I'm really interested in you being able to expand on for our audience is the conversation of the business of language access, because I think that it sort of goes into what we were just talking about, all those different elements of what language access truly entails. It goes beyond ensuring that there are bilingual staff, which we already know that isn't even enough, right? Bilingual staff is not ensuring meaningful and appropriate language services to our multilingual families. But generally speaking, this is sort of the idea that is wrapped around language access services. So thinking about those different elements, what to you is the business of language access? How can someone that potentially does not understand language access look at it through that lens in order to be able to make the connection with what they're doing and what they're offering? What is the business of language access?
Yeah. So, I think it's a couple components, right? So earlier I teased the concept of academic return on investment, right? Dollars invested for student growth. And, I think that's an important component for school leaders to understand and be able to measure and quantify, how the investment is impacting students. I think that's critical. We want to, understand what we're spending the money on, and we want to understand what we get out of it. And, taking a look at data and taking a look at the dollars spent and seeing where you're spending the money and seeing what you get for it, I think is an incredibly important component. And of course, different districts have different tools in place to measure student growth and to look at student data. There's a lot of great companies out there who do that kind of work. But, then to be able to attach, some sort of growth metric to measure, what do we get out of this investment? Of course, we made the investment, we spent X amount of dollars, but how much growth did that lead to for our multilingual families? So I really think, having a system in place that allows you to measure your impact is really important. Now, I mentioned a critical word, and I've done it a couple of times, and that's impact. So the other thing that I talk about with school leaders as it relates to academic return on investment and the work that we do in K-12 schools is, it's not about the output, right? It's about the impact. So when you're thinking about the role of an interpreter, right? And I oftentimes don't think school leaders really understand what the role of an interpreter is or how that works. But, you got to think less about the output, right? Understanding, right? They think too much. It's all, we just need to understand each other. We need to understand each other. Well, it's not always about understanding, right? Like you think about the role of an interpreter in a special education setting, okay? It's important to develop an understanding. There's lots of ways that we can go about getting an understanding from one another, right? There's tools, there's technologies, there's interpreters, there's all these different ways. But one of the important things that we're trying to do within that special education setting is establish credibility and trust with the family. That's so incredibly important in special education, especially as you start talking about, outplaced services or, different things that you want, families to react to or sign off on, or, allow their student to, take advantage of the best of what your district has to offer. You're going to need to get buy-in from that family. And allowing them to, limp their way through a conversation in broken English is not allowing them to have meaningful participation in their son or daughter's education. It's just not. So, when you think about that and you think about, academic return on investment and what we get out of it, I encourage school leaders to think about the output instead of the impact. And another thing that I like to talk about with school leaders is I'm, talking about, language access more broadly and especially, around the importance of having a language access plan. You think about lost time. Now, lost time, right? Like you think about that in a manufacturing setting, our presses are down or our conveyor belt is down. And now all of a sudden I have, 40 employees who are standing there, and I'm paying them X bucks an hour and nobody's working. That's lost time. Well, in school districts, when there's, a language barrier that we're having a hard time overcoming, or we're trying to figure out how we're going to figure out this, or how we're going to create, some understanding between this family and our staff. We don't even know what language they're speaking sometimes when they walk into the school, if there's a real, a lack of, ability to speak English. So that's lost time right there. If I'm a director of, teaching and learning at a school district and I have a family and I can't figure out how to, have a conversation with them, and I'm sitting there for 15 minutes and I'm walking down the hallway to talk to this person and I'm walking down the hall to figure this, that's lost time. And if you think about, how many multilingual learners you have across your district, and you're thinking how many interactions that they have across the district, then you start to realize how much lost time can exist and what an incredible bottleneck that is for a school district. And again, I only bring this up to reinforce the importance of having a strategic language access plan to be able to train and articulate the who's, the how's, the why's of how we go ahead and we service these families. So that's a little bit about the business of language access that I do not think that school leaders really think about as it pertains to putting together a language access plan. But it's got to be of critical importance, right?
Absolutely. I like what you just said, because it really puts an emphasis on understanding who you're serving. So if we look at it from the lens of a business, I imagine it wants to understand the audience that they're serving, right? The public that they're serving. It's like when you're thinking about the client model, what do they call it? Your avatar, right? Your client avatar. What does that individual look like? Now, I would imagine that any great business always thinks about how we're going to tailor the service to that specific audience. What are their interests? What are they looking for? What are those weak points? Wherever we look, it's all about the data that businesses are collecting in order to better understand the clients that they're serving or the audience that they're trying to serve. And it behooves me how many school districts try to do this backwards by just simply stating we are providing services without necessarily understanding the demographics. So what I'm hearing you say is that data is a very important component. You've talked about student data in the past and your experiences and how that brings shines a light into the need for potential services. And school districts do this all the time when it comes to student data, specific student data on academics, on academic growth, on engagement. They're always looking at those numbers to really sort of identify gaps first and foremost, and then of course to sort of address or tailor what those plans are going to be for the next school year in order to address those gaps. And so it behooves me whenever we talk about language access to particularly administrators that are making decisions such as this, that there's never any data around the topic of language access. And to go even further on that soapbox, they don't know how to collect the data, which is interesting, right? Because there's been conversations, I know I've had conversations with administration in which they say, well, the communicate, we've got English learners, X amount of English learners, that equates to the amount of individuals that we service, because English learners' families typically are, the ones that are in need. But if we really look at it from that angle, let's just say I always go back to thinking about how English learners are reclassified at some point, and the term for the reclassification, might differ from district to district, but let's just say that, right? No, they're no longer English learners. The fact that the English learner reclassified doesn't mean that their family did as well. So the fact that the English learner no longer needs the service or the support at the same level doesn't mean that their family member, their parents, do not. So if you're using that data point as your data to determine the language need of your families, then sorry to bust your bubble, but that's inaccurate, right? An inaccurate approach. And you should be looking further into how can we collect the data. So I suppose let's go back to the business of language access. Let's start with understanding your audience. If we look at it from the angle of a business,
client experience,
right?
Experience. That's that business language that you don't necessarily find in school sometimes. But yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's that client experience, right? It's the experience that you make for your families. It's the experience that you make for the students. It's how they feel when you walk into the building, right? I walk into school districts all the time, meeting with different folks or putting on professional development training sessions. You can tell those school districts where language access is at the core of what they do. You can feel it. And I hope all school districts strive to, be more inclusive amongst their multilingual learners for sure. And there's absolutely an opportunity for all school districts to improve on that front, but you can really see those districts that are lighthouse districts for language access and how they wrap their arms around those families, and they, get the family liaisons out into the community, and they provide those liaisons with those tools that they need to communicate with people across multiple different languages or multiple different, cultures that they represent. So,
yeah, but I would go as far as, and at this point it would be assuming, because I wouldn't know unless I went there specifically and see if they wanted to be on Brand the Interpreter podcast and have an interview with them. But I would assume that it starts with collecting the information as to who their audience are in order to be able to sort of in a way reverse engineer. Now, how do we provide the appropriate service to this particular audience? So if they're determining that there's specific languages, then that first experience of a family member that potentially might be experiencing for the very first time education in the States, what is that experience going to be like for them upon arrival? And so for the school districts or educational institutions that have it right, it's very likely because they dug a little deeper. They looked beyond the surface level of who their audience is in order to be able to provide the appropriate level of service.
And oftentimes those departments are empowered to go out and find the work and find the people to support them. They'll find the budget in these districts that really value language access, right? And in years past, with the ESSER dollars flowing, there was an incredible influx of money, available to our school systems. And many districts, did spend some of that money on ESSER funds and some of their ESSER funds on those types of services, And, it's just it's great to see. But, as I think about the landscape across the country, I do think there's a lot of work to do in the realm of language access. And, I think the conversation just needs to be shifted a little bit in terms of what the role of language services is, as opposed to just being about the output. Make it about the impact, make it about the families, and attach that to your goals, your strategic goals for your district, and driving student growth and forcing more kids and just propelling them above, grade level achievement. That's what that role is. So, hopefully we can continue to, inspire folks to, take the bull by the horns and do great things to support those communities. But I do think it all starts with a plan. And, like you said, as you think about graduating English learners or multilingual learners, outside of that designation, that in itself could have an impact on language access for those families, right? So very important to continue to tie that information back to your student information system and things like that.
Yeah, I had a guest some time back, Kleber from New York Public Schools, and he shared something that has stayed with me, throughout all this time, which basically was language access is everyone's responsibility in an educational system. It's not the responsibility of a specific department, of a specific person, of a specific maybe even team. It's everyone should have the ability to have a conversation that surrounds language access, and everyone from every level in a school district should make it their responsibility, from the teacher that is trying to schedule a meeting to meet with the family, appropriate language access, right? And thinking about, I'm going to meet with a family that speaks a language other than English, and then following the appropriate steps in order to ensure that they're able to communicate meaningfully with that family, all the way to the superintendent or even the school board, being able to think about what processes do we have in place to be able to support the families that we serve, based on demographics, based on data, not based on someone's, I think we should, right? The data tells us that we should be doing this. So I really appreciate that thought of thinking that it's everyone that has access to a student.
You made that sound really easy. Let's not oversimplify this. Like what you just laid out there is ideal, but not easy. So, when I think about having these conversations with school leaders, right? Of course, student support services or special education, or could be a multilingual department depending on the size of the school. But, they'll have, different schools are like snowflakes. Everyone's different. They'll have different requirements. They'll have different, challenges, certainly. But rolling out professional development and training around language access is not something that I've seen schools do particularly well. And what I do when I sit down with the district, I try to find those champions for language access first, at the admin level, right? Whether it be an assistant superintendent who's going to take on the charge, or your director of multilingual services, et cetera. So we want to find those champions at the district level. And then what I encourage them to do is identify champions for language access in every single building across your district. And we want to train those folks up, and we want to make them champions, and we want to increase their visibility and really market the work that they're doing. I don't think schools are very good marketers or self-promoters in the sense of, celebrating the work that they're doing. But when it comes to championing language access, stakeholders across the community need to know what those people's roles are and the type of work that they're doing, so that they can identify who they can call on when there is an issue accessing services, or you do need to arrange for an interpreter to come into a school meeting, or you want to figure out how you're going to call home. It's very difficult to train, 5,000, 10,000, staff on accessing language services. Everybody's got a lot going on. So, I think if you try to eat the elephant in one bite, it doesn't always work out so well. But if you, go ahead and you kind of take a scaffolded approach to professional development, and you identify champions for language access in every building, you're going to have a lot more success than if you, come out swinging and try to get 5,000 people on board to provide those services. So I loved everything that you said right there, but I don't want to oversimplify or undersimplify how challenging that could be, I should say.
Yeah, but I think that's in the realm, particularly of a school district, I think it's understood that that's with anything, even just, adopting a new policy, for instance, and then its rollout, right? What's that going to look like at every level, not just at the district level? My conversations exactly the same. So you could have the big picture idea, but then of course, what is that going to look like for everyone at each level? And it's going to be different. It's not going to be a blanket approach for everyone. Nevertheless, I think that thinking about that big picture, that would be the start at the very least, beginning the conversations. I like how you talked about champions for language access, because that is really thinking about the specific individuals at every level that are going to be involved, or making it their business to be involved in appropriate services, is really what it takes.
And we talked about lost time earlier, right? And the challenge that represents for a school district. And I don't think they really think about that. But if you have established champions for language access, it's one phone call. It's not walking around and trying to figure this out. And oh no, you're starting to feel the pressure. This person's been sitting here for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. They've been here for 30 minutes. I can't get anyone to help me. My goodness. But if you identify who those champions are across your buildings, then, at least you have somebody you can turn to who can be that problem solver for you, be that stopper.
Yeah, in continuing this idea, there's notion of the business of language access. We can look at we can equate your language ambassadors or your language champions, with brand ambassadors, right? So the individuals that are out there promoting the business, knowing the business, understanding at least to a level in which they're attracting the right audience, because you know who you are targeting and being able to attract the right audience to your brand. And I think it would be the same thing. It would equate to that. You've got the individuals that understand language access, that know what the services are, but they can only know that if there's that bigger picture. What's the plan?
And I will say that it's overwhelming to me how many school staff would love nothing more than to support these multilingual families, right? Great people all across the United States who want to support these multilingual families, who would bend over backwards and give them the shirt off their back, right? That's the type of people that educators are in the K-12 space, right? But when the going gets tough and you got a lot of things going on and these bottlenecks exist that you can't solve and you need to get to the next problem, then it turns out that this family's not getting services, right? Because it gets really, really hard to provide those services. And then you find, you're on Google Translate just trying to get an understanding of what one another is saying instead of driving impact, through professional language services and, really supporting those families and making them feel like, they're part of the community, regardless of, what their challenges are, with the English language. So, yeah, I think that's a very important component.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. What are you seeing, Mark, in the landscape? You have the opportunity in your current role to be able to work with districts across, the U.S. What are you seeing in terms of just maybe trends or potentially what's to come? And thinking about the technology piece and thinking about legislation. Earlier in a conversation, you mentioned the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is very well involved in this conversation as well. But the Department of Education and potentially rolling something out, which I would agree with that statement as well, only because just a couple of years ago, I do remember that they were pushing out a survey with regards to language access services, and it was our hope for those of us that are in this specific specialization that the Department of Education was getting ready to roll something out, some updated guidelines or something more specific on language access services. But what is it that you're seeing out there that is specific to K through 12 education?
Yeah. Well, so at the federal level, I think it makes sense to revisit that question after the election, right? This is going to be an important election for language access for sure. And I know the folks at the Department of Education feel that. So, that's a question that I'm probably not comfortable addressing at this time. We could speak about that, after the election and see how that turns out. But at the state and local level, there is tremendous legislation coming across all across the United States. I've seen some fascinating legislation out of the state of Illinois, where I'm from, in special education. And a lot of the legislation that they've introduced here, I believe, should be best practices for anybody, overseeing a multilingual department. So again, most of them focused on special education. So one of the things that they do in Illinois, and I think it's a tremendous thing, is they make families aware right on the IEP paperwork that they have the right to have an interpreter present that the district will pay for on an IEP meeting. Not that they'll provide one if you ask, but that it's your right. We're letting people know that it is your right to have an interpreter present for these special education meetings. That's important. On the translation side of the house, it's a requirement now in Illinois to deliver IEP paperwork 3 days in advance, translated for these families in advance of the IEP meeting. It gives them an opportunity to review the materials and come to that meeting, prepared with questions and have, truly meaningful participation in their son and daughter's the schooling. Very important. What else is going on here in Illinois that's exciting? Of course, machine translation is a huge hot topic. So, in a lot of school districts, they're doing translation work, sometimes, machine translation through their IEP software management. That can be kind of challenging in terms of getting a quality deliverable But in Illinois, it is a requirement that, IEP documents at a minimum can be machine translated with a human post editor. So that's a very important component in terms of delivering a quality deliverable to these families so that they can actually, and when you think about special education language and the vernacular and some of that language, it's very technical, it's specific, it does not play well with different machine translation engines that we've done testing with, and it's not something that we should be using at this time within education. So I think it's really exciting that Illinois has introduced legislation specifically around special education and language access. I know in Colorado, they've kind of mimicked that legislation, and they've just recently introduced that. In New Jersey, there's a requirement, I think it's Language Access Bill 3435, requiring school districts to have their top 7 languages translated, all the materials, whether it be, registration, IEP documents, things like that, consent forms, student field trip forms need to be translated in all their top 7 languages. Now, in terms of compliance at the state level, I don't know how that's going to roll out. I really don't know, but I know there's a lot of legislation coming at the state level in a lot of different places all across the country that really, just kind of amplifies what's going on at the federal level. I think, some of that language around language access at the federal level is kind of ambiguous as it relates to what is required of a district in order to, follow through and deliver services to these multilingual families. I don't love the language that's currently been introduced at the federal level, but I think it's really exciting that different states are making improvements and creating their own best practices. And, it's up to people like me to get out and celebrate those successes and introduce that legislation and tell people, that these changes are, coming all across the United States. And, look at what folks in Illinois are doing. And can we just imagine what the impact of that's going to be on students and family? I think that's pretty neat. So I think it's, imperative for folks that are passionate about language access to do their best to influence and, try to have conversations with lawmakers whenever possible. Mireya, you have a great platform here, and, it would be fascinating to, hear stories from, folks from the DOE or, different people who focus on state legislation, come on your show. I haven't gotten too deep into the roster yet in terms of what I've listened to, but it's a very important conversation. It's a conversation that's going to continue to evolve. And I think ultimately we're going to continue to work through a process of continuous improvement as it relates to language access legislation, where I think, the guidelines from the federal government will become more clear in time. And that's really what I hope to see, 4 years from now.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There's that federal guidelines that are out there. You have to dig for them, and you have to know what you're looking for in order to find them. So in my ideal world, there'd be a language access platform at the federal level to be able to support at the state level whatever their endeavors are. And you're right. I mean, from Illinois to New Jersey, Washington State.
Oh, Washington State
rolled out theirs.
Phenomenal.
No, I mean there's Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken, rolled out theirs as well. And then I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I heard this last year at the AAITE conference, their annual conference, Maryland is looking to do something like that as well. So yeah, we're seeing, and this is very specific to public education, that's like, it's the greatest for me, at least. It's like, wow, I can't believe this is happening, across the nation, which is amazing. But then of course we've got the state level, and schools still don't know what to do, even if there is guidance at that level. So there's still a need for understanding and information, absolutely, and being able to have a platform such as this to continue to bring out information and share information. I think it's a privilege for me, and it's an honor to be able to do so and have conversations with individuals like you, Mark, that have an understanding of the need and what potentially schools can do in order to be able to support their need. So I want to thank you very much, Mark, for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And I always allow the opportunity for guests to share a little bit more about where they're currently at, what services are being provided, and how our audience could potentially reach out to you and connect with you. So at this time, I'd like to open it up and allow you the opportunity to share about where you're currently at, what services are being provided, and how individuals can get a hold of you if they'd like.
Yeah, well, I'm never hard to find, right? Mark Byrne, I'm with PGLS. I oversee all of their K-12 initiatives around translation, interpretation, language training. Very excited to launch a language access planning consulting arm of our business here this fall. So we got a couple districts who are going to serve as pilots for us in terms of creating a comprehensive language access plan that's going to involve some well, I don't want to get into it too much until I have something to roll out. But very excited about the opportunity that I have. PGLS offers language services in 200 languages and regional dialects. We also offer free professional development and training on our systems and software for our K-12 clients, as well as best practices on optimizing the impact of language services in a K-12 setting, which could absolutely be another podcast for another day. So, Mireya, again, thank you for all the work you do and giving me this platform to come in and talk about the business of language access. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Sounds great to me. Thank you,
Thanks
Mark.
so much.